Okay. Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for coming. Uh, it is a great pleasure for me to welcome our speaker this evening, Professor George Pattison. I'm going to introduce him in just 2 minutes. Before that, uh, I'd like to say just a few words, which several things I already mentioned 2 hours ago, but because I see some new people came in. So I feel like um, going back to that again. So basically, there is a new program at the Institute for Human Sciences. It's called the World in Pieces program, which is the continuation of the previous originally Russia-Eurasia program. So the program started in January this month, and this is our opening event. That's why we're hoping very much it will go well and attract attention. We're starting a lecture series which is called Reading Russian Philosophy in the Age of Putin. The lecture series partly looks at the whole phenomenon of rereading great literature and philosophy, revisiting great art and so on. And of course, the whole idea being that with great philosophy and literature, every age has its own reading, and you hear the voices in a different way. So our age makes no exception, and this is partly some of the questions we're trying to address here. Like, as I mentioned before, we think of a war going on in Ukraine, but also a culture war over who's going to appropriate Russian culture, claim to be the heir of Russian culture and so on. And I think that it is interesting that a lot of what you read in newspapers and magazines these days, for some reason there is a disproportionate focus on Dostoevsky. And this is why I thought that it is so fortunate that George agreed to give a talk on one of his fields of specialization, which is Dostoevsky, a talk which relates to his forthcoming book. I'd like to read to you several quotes from some recent articles I've been coming across in the media. So this is from The Economist in October. Today, Dostoevsky and other Russian writers seem to point the way to the front in the Donbass. The Times Literary Supplement from April 2022. Books are the camouflage net of Russia's tanks in Ukraine. And then from the Times Literary Supplement, an article which ends, if you're looking for the roots of Russia's violence against its neighbors, its desire to erase their history, and its rejection of ideas of liberal democracy, you will find some of your answers on the pages of Pushkin, Lermontov, and Dostoevsky. So on the one hand, I think that one extreme way of looking at that has been basically to call literally for a boycott of Russian literature and philosophy. On the other hand, I want to finish with two quotes from, one is from T.S. Eliot about my two favorite writers and novelists, where he says that Henry James and Dostoevsky don't provide us with ideas, but with another world of thought and feelings. And Hemingway, who writes about how he came skiing to Austria. And when he was in the skiing resort, he was reading Dostoevsky. And he says, in Dostoevsky, there were things believable and things not to be believed, but some so true, they changed you as you read. Frailty and madness, wickedness and saintliness, and so on. So I think that this is sort of the vague background of some of the ideas in this lecture series. So I'd like to very briefly introduce George Pattison. He's taught at Cambridge, Oxford. He was the professor of divinity at Oxford, at Aarhus in Denmark, and finally at Glasgow, where he's an honorary professorial fellow. He's written a lot on existential philosophy, on Kierkegaard, Heidegger, Russian religious philosophy, especially Dostoevsky. We met in the context of the Oxford Handbook of Russian Religious Philosophy, who was one of the editors, together with Randall Poole and Carol Emerson. It's an edited volume that Christoph Schneider, that some of you heard just a while ago, Christoph contributed to this volume as well. And now George has a new book coming out with Oxford University Press, which is called Conversations with Dostoevsky, which I think is a great title. He's not a stranger to our institute, though I think you've never been physically here before, but he was the keynote speaker in 2020 at an international conference we co-organized with the Russian Art and Culture Group in Bremen in Germany. So the conference was called The Problem of Religious Art in Modernity. So thank you very much for agreeing to come, and it's a great pleasure to host you here. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Clemena, for the invitation and for the introduction there. Yeah, I mean, I actually finished the first draft of the manuscript of Conversations with Dostoevsky last January, and it's an unusual book. It's semi-fictional. Two-thirds of it are a series of imagined conversations with Dostoevsky taking place today in Glasgow. And the last third is a kind of academic commentary on that, giving chapter and verse for the references and discussions about the theoretical points that are raised. But anyway, I finished this manuscript last January and sent a proposal into Oxford University Press, beginning of February. Of course, naturally, the people who then read the manuscript or the draft of it said, well, he's going to have to talk about the war in Ukraine. You can't today publish about Dostoevsky. And, they knew that when I wrote it, that hadn't yet happened. And of course, they're right. And I knew that myself, though the book already did deal with Dostoevsky's politics. And this, what I'm going to say today, relates to that, but in a way relating it far more explicitly to everything that's happened since last February. So I shall discuss Dostoevsky's presence in the ideology of Putinism under three overlapping headings: the critique of the West, politics, and what we might call Russia's religious or metaphysical identity. I shall then finish, perhaps unusually, by applying Dostoevsky's analysis of nihilism to the career of the Russian president, Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. So first of all, critique of the West. In his Valdai conference in autumn 2022, Russian President Vladimir Putin made two explicit references to Dostoevsky. He said, and I quote from the official Kremlin website, "At one time, the Nazis reached the point of burning books, and now the Western, quote, guardians of liberalism and progress have reached the point of banning Dostoevsky and Tchaikovsky. The so-called cancel culture, and in reality, as we said many times, the real cancellation of culture is eradicating everything that is alive and creative and stifles free thought in all areas, be it economics, politics, or culture." Of course, this is a grossly, one could say absurdly, exaggerated statement. As regards Dostoevsky, it is true that Milan Bicocca University cancelled a course on Dostoevsky immediately following the invasion of Ukraine. But it was reinstated within days, following an outcry both within the university and globally. As for Tchaikovsky, the recent holiday season has seen the standard share of nutcrackers and Swan Lakes. Opening my Sunday newspaper on the 1st of January, I found a calendar of musical events to watch out for in January, listing one major musical event a day. These included Tchaikovsky, Stravinsky, and Rachmaninoff. 1 in 10 composers represented being Russian in a field including Germany, France, Britain, America, Austria, Hungary, Italy, Norway, Argentina, and several others. So and some Russians might say, well, there should have been 4 or 5 Russians out of the 30, but you know, 1 in 10 isn't so bad. Certainly not a case of cancellation. The big musical event in January actually in Britain is the sort of anniversary of Rachmaninoff. This is the thing that's getting most written up of all at the moment. Perhaps more important than the factual accuracy of Putin's statement, as in our last session, you know, facts have their uses, is the point he wants to make with it, which is a point he's been making for many years. This is that the model of globalization being promoted by the American-led West is one that negates all differences of culture and value. In Putin's own words again from same speech, standardization, financial and technological monopoly, the erasure of all differences is what underlies the Western model of globalization, which is neo-colonial in nature. By way of contrast, Russia's approach to globalization is one that affirms the variety of cultural traditions, allowing each culture, European, African, American, or Asian, to go its own way. Putin again, quote, "For 1,000 years, Russia has developed a unique culture of interaction between all world religions. There is no need to cancel anything, be it Christian values, Islamic values, or Jewish values. We have other world religions as well. All you need to do is respect each other," a point he extends to other areas of cultural practice. To paraphrase, we are not trying to stop the West having its gay pride parades. We just don't want them here. Let us be different. This is the Russian way. As many of you will know, gay pride parades play a particularly important part in the rhetoric of the Patriarch of Moscow, Kirill, who sees precisely the phenomena of gay pride parades as indicating the metaphysical nature of the conflict between Russia and the West. On this point about the variety of traditions, Putin quotes the 19th century thinker Danilevsky, but of course the thought is not strange to Dostoevsky, as we see in his remarks about Russian intervention in the Balkan Wars, when he insists that Russia's aim vis-à-vis Western Europe is not to subordinate the West. On the contrary, he writes that we seek to achieve our own welfare, not through the suppression of national individualities alien to us, but on the contrary, we perceive our welfare in the freest and most independent development of all other nations and in brotherly communion with them, though he anticipates being laughed at for these views while simultaneously preaching the justice of Russia's cause versus Turkey and the European powers. Now, of course, the idea of the emerging bourgeois industrial world as affecting standardization, mechanization, etc., was and has been for a long time widespread in the West itself, analyzed already by Schiller in his letters on the aesthetic education of man in 1794, taken up by Kierkegaard in 1846 under the rubric of leveling, Nivellierung, and since then repeated in manifold formulations via Weber's analysis of secularization and disenchantment through the Frankfurt School and down to the present. Schiller was an important point of reference for Dostoevsky, of course, and whilst the Russian writer clearly didn't know of Kierkegaard or the Frankfurt School, we can reasonably position him, I think, as part of a Europe-wide tradition of cultural critique. In other words, as it touches on something that came up in the last session, this is not a uniquely Russian view of modernization, even if it has acquired a particular salience in Russia. Many Western readers have praised Dostoevsky on just this point, for showing that human beings could not be reduced to the logic of 2 × 2 = 4, and their needs cannot be calculated according to the laws of algorithms. Both comments from Notes from Underground. Dostoevsky says logarithms, but I think he's anticipating what we're now living through with social media. So my point is that whether or not we deem this analysis to be insightful and useful, it's not something that's distinctively Russian, and one can find very parallel analyses in the German tradition across Europe, really. Although, of course, to be fair to Putin on this point, he is indeed saying just what Dostoevsky was saying, though in a different context. Putin does not himself quote Notes from Underground, though he alludes to the anthill, an image from that novel, he turns instead to demons, facie, and in particular the nihilist Shigalev, who, as Putin says, quote, described the bright future he imagined in the following way, quote, emerging from boundless freedom, I conclude with boundless despotism. This is what our Western opponents have come to. Another character of the novel, Pyotr Verkovensky, echoes him, I'm still Putin, talking about the need for universal treason, reporting and spying, and claiming that society does not need talents or greater abilities. Cicero's tongue is cut out. Copernicus has his eyes gouged out, and Shakespeare is stoned. This is what our Western opponents are arriving at. What is this, if not Western cancel culture? Of course, Putin does not stumble or pause over the irony that many 20th century readers took Shigalev's speech as prophesying the coming Bolshevik revolution. Still less over the further irony that he himself developed his career by eagerly working in a system reliant on universal treason, reporting, and spying, and incidentally a system that exiled two of the other figures he cites with approval in the same speech, Alexander Zinoviev and Alexander Solzhenitsyn. I mean, he worked for the organ of state directly involved in bringing about their exile. So, as regards the critique of the West, Putin certainly isn't misguided in drawing on Dostoevsky. Nor is he alone in doing so. A 2014 exhibition by the artist Yuri Danich featured a work entitled Demons, portraying a selection of Putin's liberal opponents as the eponymous demons from Dostoevsky's novel. Indicative of the stakes in such interpretations is the fact that one of these demons was Boris Nemtsov, who I'm sure everyone here knows was murdered the following year in what is widely regarded as a politically motivated assassination. The television version of that same novel, including an emphatic presentation of a speech by one of the key characters on Russia's God-bearing mission, was broadcast, I think, simultaneously on several channels of Russian television on the same day as the May 2014 presidential elections in Ukraine, with clear political implications. I'll return to this speech and its representation in the television version later. So as regards critique of the West, we could say that at least at a purely sort of abstract level, Putin and Dostoevsky are speaking from the same page, but then it's a page that many, many other people are speaking from in many, many other different contexts. So I turn more directly to politics, but first of all to, as it were, Dostoevsky's own politics without immediate reference to where we're at today. Dostoevsky's participation in the Petrushevsky circle and his consequent imprisonment won him lifelong respect amongst Russian radicals, further enhanced by his chronicle of prison life in the House of the Dead. Ideologically, Dostoevsky's position during the Petrushevsky period is hard to define, and perhaps he had no exactly defined position. But it seems to have been a kind of Christian-influenced utopianism that was very far from Marxist communism that wasn't in any case at that point an active element in Russian political life. But during his time in prison, Dostoevsky underwent a radical change of views and emerged as a fervent supporter of the Tsar, as testified by 3 poems written in 1854 and 1855 that are overflowing with patriotic sentiments. Also, we can say it's just as well that he turned to novel writing rather than poetry. It's not great poetry. But the content of the poetry: Russia's cause in the Crimean War is Christ's. Britain and France are portrayed as the new crucifiers of Christ, in league with the Muslim Turk. The third of the poems is specifically dedicated to the new Tsar, Alexander II, widely expected to inaugurate an era of reform, including the abolition of serfdom. Now, the exact timing and nature of Dostoevsky's conversion remains debated in the academic literature. On the basis of the House of the Dead, it seems to have been linked to the experience of Easter in the prison and to new insights reinforced by childhood memories of the deep kindness and Christian charity found beneath an often brutal exterior in the hearts of the peasants. But whatever the precise details, it's clear that by the time of his release from prison and the start of his military service, he had to serve 4 years as a soldier without ranks, without rights, reduced to the ranks in the Russian army after his release from prison. Dostoevsky's thinking about Russia's political and social order and its place in world history was guided by 3 very clear defining elements: a belief in the benign and paternal sovereignty of the Russian Tsar, the spirit of Orthodox faith, and the Christ-likeness of the peasant, i.e. Russian, heart. Although the role of the Tsar isn't mentioned in any of the novels, presumably due to conditions of censorship, this is made good in the diary of a writer, while the themes of orthodoxy and peasant charity are found in fiction and non-fiction alike. It's in the diary that we find the fullest exposition of Dostoevsky's view of Russia and Russia's role in the international order. This is easily portrayed as a case of 19th century imperial nationalism. Dostoevsky applauds the young Russians who volunteered to defend Bulgaria against Ottoman repression. Perhaps Bulgarians are still thankful for that. And he wholeheartedly supports the open declaration of war against Turkey in 1877. He suggests that war can have a cleansing effect on a nation. Russia, he believes, has been ordained by divine providence to take Constantinople and re-establish it as the capital of orthodoxy. The Tatars should be expelled from Crimea and replaced with Russians. And if the Russians fail to do this, the Tatars will be replaced by the Jews at the Jews' initiative. At some points, Dostoevsky's Russian exceptionalism seems to imply that Russia can only be judged by the standards that it itself deems appropriate. For example, in what I find a particularly disturbing comment, he states that although a policy of peace and not blood is generally true, and even holy, it cannot, in the particular situation of the time, be applied to Russia, I quote, but in this case somehow they are inapplicable to Russia. Russia at this particular historic moment constitutes, so to speak, an exception. You can't get clearer than that. However, in what I think is an important qualification of all this, Dostoevsky's argument hinges on the specifically Christian character of the Tsar's rule. Russian action, he claims, is not directed at territorial conquest, but at the liberation of the Balkan peoples, who are fellow Slavs and fellow Orthodox. In these terms, it might be possible to argue that what he is promoting is what we might call a humanitarian intervention. In other words, to prevent the Balkan and Slavic people from what was indeed not a very benign rule by the collapsing and often brutal Ottoman Empire. Whether it's plausibly applicable to the actual conduct of the war is another matter, of course. And likewise, although he insists that Russia, having taken Constantinople, should remain there, it doesn't annex it into Russia, but is to make it into an open, but is to secure it as a capital city for all of orthodoxy. At the same time, tellingly, I think, he defines his own views as utopian, indicating his awareness that others will dismiss them as incompatible with the realities of international affairs. So too in his defense of war. He first assigns the argument that war can be good for a nation to an anonymous dreamer, whom he calls a paradoxicalist, though he later does make the same argument in his own voice. Now, unlike Slavophiles such as Khomyakov and Ivan Kireevsky, Dostoevsky did not fantasize about an idyllic past, when the Russian people supposedly lived in an organic and almost prehistoric harmony in the bosom of a unified church order. On the contrary, there are elements in the novels that point to a particularly dark and violent streak in archaic Russian society. This comes out especially, I think, in characters such as Murin in The Landlady and Rogozhin in The Idiot, who are also associated with the old believers. So he's not saying everything was wonderful back then in Russia. There is a kind of darkness and a violence in Russia that's very, very dangerous. Instead of this, he's not looking back to that idyllic time, but to a new movement on what he perceives as now coming to pass in the spirit of the Russian people, which of course resonates with the idea of Russia as a God-bearing people, something that is even now, as it were, coming out into the open. But it can also be seen in less mythical terms and correlated with the pressing need for moral and social reform within Russian society itself. In other words, it's not a matter of regaining what has been lost, but of looking at what Russians need to be doing now to make Russia a truly Christian society by bringing about a more just and harmonious social order in which key elements that interested Dostoevsky are education, cultural formation, the enhancement of women's place in society, and the development of a robust legal framework, truly fitted for the dispensing of justice. Of course, in the terms in which he himself frames it, Dostoevsky's universalism, his belief that what Russia is doing is for the benefit of all nations, is questionable, at the very least, as a political proposal in his own time. But it is, I think, more plausible in his view of the relationship between Russian and European literature. This is prominent in the Pushkin address that he gave in Moscow in 1880, and that was the climax of his life as a public personality in Russian society. Here he insists on Pushkin's specific genius, and by extension the genius of Russian literature as a whole, as consisting in a capacity for, quote, universal susceptibility and all reconciliation. Rephrasing this claim, we may say that, according to Dostoevsky, the Russian writer, and more broadly the Russian character, is able to enter into and reveal a vision of spiritual life that is truer to Europe's own unrealized aspirations than European literature itself. In other words, Russia's contribution to Europe will essentially be a vision of human life that provides a significant and specifically Christian alternative to the political economy that now dominates European life and that is crushing Europe's own culture. If we step back from this, in fact, I think it's not entirely delusional to say that history has partially vindicated his prognostications. Russian literature and a certain vision of the Orthodox heart, historically accurate or not, became an important, even crucial elements in Western European cultural and religious development in the 20th century. The explosion, as it were, of the Russian novel, of the Russian ballet, of Russian art, of Russian music, of Russian spirituality into the Western European stage in the first decade of the 20th century was a major cultural event. And there's interesting recent book in Britain, The Vogue for Russia, of how for a while so everything had to be Russian, and it was so exciting, and it was a sort of opening up of many new horizons. Dostoevsky himself, of course, you quote T.S. Eliot and Hemingway, Virginia Woolf on honeymoon, reading Dostoevsky for the first time in the early 1900s, kind of shut the book and wrote, "It's obvious that Dostoevsky is the greatest novelist ever," just like that. So enormous impact. But of course, not only Dostoevsky, but Tolstoy, Chekhov, and others were received as a new revelation, in a way, of what literature could do. And the string of Western European writers influenced by these Russians is just, it's pretty closely identical with the canon of great 20th century Western novelists. So for all his Russianness, Dostoevsky became a universal voice. And in that way, at that level, I think his argument about the contribution of Russia has some validity, even if it sounds exaggerated. And you mentioned my work on Kierkegaard. There's pages and pages of his diary where Kierkegaard talks about himself as the most brilliant person living in Denmark and how he's the only genius in Copenhagen. You think, gosh, this guy's full of himself. And then you think, who else was writing in the 1840s in Copenhagen in philosophy that we're reading today? Answer, no one. And the other people who were much more regarded at that time, they now appear as footnotes to Kierkegaard, and they're basically only read by Kierkegaard researchers. So, it sounds kind of crazy, but actually it's true. So, interestingly, despite his praise of orthodoxy, Tsarist rule, and the new movement stirring in the life of the peasants, the one instance in the novels where Dostoevsky does start to give flesh to his idea of a new kind of community, is the story of how Alyosha Karamazov reconciles a group of quarreling boys, schoolboys, and at the very end of the novel gathers them together before sending them out into the world in a deliberate analogy to Christ and his disciples. Now, although Alyosha is from the outside known to be a Christian, the actual content of his dealings with the boys is not in any sense overtly religious, other than that it is a story of forgiveness, community formation, and ends by invoking the possibility of an eternal memory for their dead friend Ilyusha. Indeed, at this point, Alyosha has left the monastery and is living as a secular man in the world. And strikingly, the boys whom he gathers into this community are not peasants, but middle-class schoolboys, grammar school boys. Alyosha's story, we know, was not finished. But on the basis of what we have, to the extent that his work with the boys is a template for the renewal of Russia, Dostoevsky's vision would seem to be more of a kind of bottom-up democracy of practical Christian love, rather than the reinforcement of top-down, state-legislated orthodoxy. I'll come back to that later. The metaphysics of Dostoevsky's nationalism. As we've seen, Dostoevsky, like Vladimir Putin, saw the principal threat to the Russian world of Tsar, church, and people as being from the kind of Western liberal values that he associated with Britain, France, and intellectually German idealism. These alien influences became manifest in the nihilism of the 1860s, and while each of the major novels thematizes the issues revealed in nihilism to some degree, it is the possessed that develops these in an unambiguously political manner. The novel draws on the recent and notorious Nechayev case, named after one of the most extreme political nihilists of the time, whose Catechism of a Revolutionary created a profile of the ruthlessly single-minded revolutionary activist that would be emulated by many later Bolsheviks. Like Nechayev, the novel's Peter Verhovensky orders his revolutionary cell to murder one of their own members in order to cement their loyalty to each other. Nikolai Stavrogin, whom Verhovensky hopes will be the charismatic leader of the revolutionary movement, has similarly been compared to Mikhail Bakunin, an important 19th century theorist of anarchism. These connections were implicitly acknowledged by the Soviet authorities, who for many years kept the possessed out of print, though, as has been shown, this censorship kind of came and went according to the position of Bakunin in Soviet ideology. At some times he was more approved, at some times he was less approved. When he was more approved, the possessed appeared kind of briefly, and then it went away again. I mentioned briefly the idea of Russia as a God-bearing nation that's presented in this novel by the character Ivan Shatov, who is in fact the member of the group who gets assassinated. Sorry if you haven't read it. In a conversation with Stavrogin, the archdemon of the novel, Shatov declares that Russia is, quote, a God-bearing people, destined to regenerate and save the world in the name of a new God. And it is to this people that the keys of life and the new world are to be given. He rejects Stavrogin's objection that this reduces God to an attribute of nationality. On the contrary, he says, I raise the people to God. He claims that every great nation, starting with the Jews, has been defined by faith in its own divine calling, but, he continues, there is only one truth, and therefore only a single one out of the nations can have the true God, even though other nations have great gods of their own. Only one nation is God-bearing, that's the Russian people. But is Shatov's confession of faith Dostoevsky's? Many have thought so. In an influential article, still cited, from 1947, Hans Kohn sums up what he sees as the author's and character's view as, quote, the exclusive fanaticism of a racial god, which he states is proclaimed here as in most primitive antiquity without any trace of the ethical sublimation into the God of universal justice demanded by the Hebrew prophets. More recently, the 2014 television adaptation I spoke of before validates Shatov's speech by changing the setting from night to day and having him speak against a background dominated by the golden domes of a Russian church, reflecting the sun that often has associations of divinity in Dostoevsky's writing, thus visually linking the speaker's Russian god to orthodoxy. However, at least until recently, Shatov's ideas would be unrecognizable to any orthodox theology, the starting point of which is the Trinitarian revelation of God in Christ. But are Shatov's and Dostoevsky's ideas the same? Or are Shatov's ideas in fact a variant of the nihilism that the novel is dedicated to unmasking? We learn that Shatov had originally learned this idea, in fact, from Stavrogin himself, who has since disowned it. We've heard that Stavrogin makes the obvious objection that Shatov is reducing God to an attribute of nationality. And pressed further, it's not clear that, fervent as he is, Shatov's response entirely deflects the charge. Challenged by Stavrogin as to whether he actually believes in God, Shatov stutters, I will believe in God. Importantly, as I've indicated, the whole conversation takes place not just at night time, but in a section of the novel entitled Night, and immediately follows after another of the nihilists, Kirillov, has explained his ambition to become God by committing suicide and thus freeing humanity from religion. I won't go into further details. So perhaps then Dostoevsky is taking us on a short tour of the varieties of self-deification to be found amongst those who have left orthodoxy behind. The deification of the individual, in Kirillov's case, followed by the deification of the nation, in Shatov's case. Starting with its nocturnal setting and the atmosphere of near hysteria that Dostoevsky creates, the text itself gives reasons to doubt Shatov's visionary but uncertain messianism. As I say, it's telling that the 2014 television version, broadcast on a particularly significant political day, recontextualized Shatov's words into a bright, sunny day, creating a very different mood from what we experience in the novel. However, some would say, Shatov isn't the only Dostoevskian character to speak of Russia as a god-bearing nation. Indeed, the holy Elder Zosima, probably Dostoevsky's mouthpiece for his best version, as it were, of Orthodox Christianity, uses the same expression. But, versus Shatov, he assumes that God does indeed exist, that it is God who will answer the monk's prayer and who will save Russia. The truth that the monks preserve is the truth kept, quote, from the times of the fathers of old, the apostles and the martyrs, and their task requires obedience, fasting, and prayer. Russia will reveal this truth to the world, as Zosima puts it, that star will arise from the east, but it did not invent that truth. And a people who is the vehicle of God's coming into existence, Shatov, is very different, I suggest, from the people called to serve God in humility. But one might say in parenthesis, can there be a politics of humility? And how might we distinguish between narratives of national humility and the narratives of national humiliation that have often fed the ressentiment that drives states to vengeful self-assertion, as we may say, Germany in the 1930s, perhaps Russia after the wild years of the 1990s. Dostoevsky's political statements in the diary are directly political, yet his idealized image of Russia has perhaps a certain poetic and imaginative power that isn't reducible to the political. As in many other cases, an idealized national image of one's own country is Janus-faced. Seen from one angle, it presents a hostile face towards the rest of the world. Seen from another, it can be a call and a challenge to the nation concerned to live up to its own best possibilities. The Romantic poet William Blake wrote a poem called Jerusalem, which played on a legend that Christ had spent his hidden years living in England. Did those feet in ancient times walk upon England's green and pleasant land? And then he says, shall we build Jerusalem here in this green and pleasant land? Now, William Blake was a kind of revolutionary figure, writing in the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, and his poem is clearly a call to defy the powers that be and the authorities and to create a very different kind of England from the England that was being created by the industrialists. But it's interesting that today, in a musical setting from the high imperial era, the later 19th century, it's actually sung in a very unnuanced way, simply as an affirmation of how wonderful England is, rather than, as it were, a vision of what England isn't, but ought to be. And maybe there's something of that going on in Dostoevsky. A concrete example is, I think, the Prince Mushkin's hyperbolic speech in The Idiot, where he addresses a group of aristocrats and about how wonderful the Russian aristocrats are and how they will save the nation and they will educate the people and their moral standing. But of course, Dostoevsky makes clear that these aristocrats in the room are nothing like that at all. They're all either completely boring or morally corrupt. They're not how Mushkin imagines them. They're very far from the virtues he's praising. And in fact, through Mushkin, the author makes clear that his praise of the aristocracy that we read in the novel is actually an indictment of the aristocracy, because they are not living up to these standards. They are not doing what they ought to do if they were true to their own principles. And so it's not difficult to extend the example to Russia as a whole. The vision of a nation brought together through prayerful and hard-earned solidarity with every member of society, inclusive of all its insulted and injured unfortunates, each of whose stories deserves remembering as part of the national story. A nation whose members are committed to mutual forgiveness and forbearance, who celebrate their distinctive cultural life and not least their natural environment, isn't an ignoble vision. And if this is Dostoevsky's democracy, it's not hard to see why it may continue, rightly, to inspire those suffering the continuing tragedy of Russian history, and equally those in many other nations, where people remain condemned to subcultures of poverty, family breakdown, violence, alcohol and drug addiction, and whose situation is compounded by the exclusiveness of educational, legal and religious systems, all of which is plentifully and unrelentingly displayed in Dostoevsky's novels. But as with William Blake and Prince Mushkin and the aristocrats, whether Dostoevsky's poetic and spiritually ideal Russia is identical with the Russia promoted as a fact by today's Russian world ideology is an entirely different matter. Dostoevsky's politics today. Here we come to a crucial point in considering the relationship between Dostoevsky and contemporary Russian nationalism. As I mentioned, Dostoevsky's own nationalism is intimately connected to his veneration for the Tsar, the role of orthodoxy in national life. But what follows from this? One internet article of the genre that we've already heard from declares that, quote, Dostoevsky's endorsement of the Tsar's autocratic regime and orthodoxy of the church would lead one safely to assume that he could have supported Putin's initiatives in the renewal of Russia's place in the world as a model for mankind. Now, this assumption seems to me to be far from safe, as the author supposes, because it means identifying today's political order with that of Dostoevsky's time. But as the whole world knows, Russia has since then been convulsed by a series of titanic social, political, and cultural upheavals. The 1917 revolution, Stalinism, the Patriotic War, the fall of the Soviet Union, the Wild West years of the 1990s, followed by the restorationist rule of President Putin. Now, we may concede that a key to Putin's extraordinary political success is that he's been able to manipulate the symbols of political life to identify himself both as a new Tsar I have one Russian correspondent who's applied this title to him non-ironically and in a positive sense, and who upbraids me for not seeing that Putin is a new Christian Tsar, and yet at the same time appealing to those Russians who see him as continuing what was good about the Soviet Union. So he is both a kind of Tsar and a commissar. And now, this may be politically effective. It is. But it's not intellectually coherent. We may add that quite apart from Putin, the Russian experience and the Russian language itself, language is always very important when we're talking about a novelist, of course, have been profoundly affected by the traumas of the 20th and 21st centuries. Change is also exacerbated by the impact that social media are having on the nature of Russian discourse, in this respect, of course, comparable to their impact around the world. So certainly it seems to me far from self-evident that the Russia for which Dostoevsky spoke is the same Russia that is promoted by Putinism. And it's at the very least open to question whether Dostoevsky himself could have, as the article puts it, thought so. The fact that Putin himself and other Russian nationalists today appeal to Dostoevsky in support of their position cannot be allowed to decide the matter. In an insightful article on literary heritage in the 1930s, Georg Lukács argued that one of the most urgent tasks of the time was to rebut the Nazis' claim that they represented the true tradition of German culture as represented by Goethe, Schiller, and others. I mean, they also enlisted Jesus and Shakespeare and Bach as kind of Aryan culture heroes. But the fact of the claim doesn't prove that it's correct. So too in Russia today. But if we can, as it were, rescue Dostoevsky from Russian world ideology, this is perhaps a meager outcome. Does he have anything more constructive to offer? Dostoevsky on Putin. Andrei Glucksmann's application of Dostoevsky's analysis of Russian nihilism to contemporary Islamic terrorism has been widely publicized. In his book, Dostoevsky and Manhattan, and many interviews and articles, Glucksmann argues that despite its rhetoric, its religious rhetoric, what is called Islamism is an essentially nihilistic movement of the same kind as that of which Peter Verhovensky was a 19th century representative. As Glucksmann sums up, quote, "The inner nature of this nihilistic terrorism is that everything is permissible, whether because God exists and I am his representative, or because God does not exist and I take his place." In other words, it comes out at the same point. What has been less widely commented on is that, writing in 2002, Glucksmann extends the same logic to the Russian president. Now, I shall be quoting a little bit from Glucksmann, and I'd say now that his rhetoric is arguably excessive. It's perhaps more journalistic than academic, but that nevertheless there may be an important point to consider. Also, his indictment of Putin is not of Putin only, but of the global elite, primarily the G7 countries that encouraged and accepted Putin's accession to their ranks, despite his fairly clear non-disavowal of the organization through which he had built his career. They knew just what they were doing. When George Bush took him to his ranch and looked in his eyes, he saw someone who had the same values as he did. Glucksmann thinks that's right, but not in the way George Bush intended. As Glucksmann writes, quote, I say you may find this a bit excessive, "The Russian leader draws his legitimacy from his tutelary organization, the Cheka, OGPU, NKVD, KGB, FSB, effective organizations that over half a century have shed the blood of tens of millions. At the same time, he's attentive to what he sees as Putin's chameleon-like qualities that allow him to appear in multiple roles, quote, as an admiral of the fleet on the bridge of a nuclear submarine, and as a sailor in a striped jumper working in the hold, as a champion judo player and fighter pilot, lounging by the pool in his swimming trunks, a skier emeritus, wearing a medallion of the Virgin, the ambitions of a sneak, dreaming at the age of 14 of a career in the KGB, laying flowers on the tomb of Andropov and on that of Sakharov. We might think that something similar could, of course, be said of many political leaders throughout the world. However, for Glucksmann, this is all further and crucially contextualized by the brutality with which Putin suppressed Chechen resistance in the Second Chechen War of 1999 to 2000, noting that the well-known novelist John le Carré had already called for Putin's indictment at The Hague in 2001 in connection with the Second Chechen War. The parallel with Islamism is made when Glucksmann, having spoken of an infernal Stalinism-Islamism, wonders whether, nevertheless, the Western democracies will celebrate Russia, its petrol, its mafias, and its despotism, like a second Saudi Arabia, and its suffering like that of a giant Pakistan. Well, of course, up until last year, he was entirely right. Dostoevsky isn't directly invoked in this analysis of the Russian president, but the phenomenology of nihilism set out in The Possessed is the larger context in which Glucksmann's analysis is developed. So what would or could Dostoevsky have thought? Well, of course, he was a creative novelist. He could or would have thought many things. Perhaps he might have seen Putin as a new Tsar and the invasion of Ukraine in the same terms that he saw Russia's intervention in the Balkan Wars of the 1870s. Yet his analysis of that crisis, rescuing fellow Orthodox Slavs from Turkish rule, can't directly be applied to an attack on fellow Orthodox Slavs, surely. Can't we equally well speculate that he could have, might have, would have seen Putin as a new Peter Verhovensky, using a network of subterfuge and disinformation to establish a terroristic rule over the Russian people? Or perhaps, like Stavrogin, a new false Tsar, as in the time of troubles in the 17th century. Stavrogin's directly compared at one point in the novel to the false Tsar. And what would he make of Patriarch Kirill's enthusiasm for a metaphysical war against the West? A Christian leader who finally spoke Russia's truth to the world? Or a new Grand Inquisitor advancing the Church's cause with worldly violence? And it's interesting that his praise of Russia's orthodoxy rarely mentions the hierarchy. Indeed, he explicitly says it's not to be identified with the liturgy and the hierarchy, but with the heart of the peasant. And indeed, most of the clergy who appear in Dostoevsky's novels are not terribly attractive characters. He has a pretty negative view of the clergy as a whole. Zosima and the few monks who are faithful to him are very much an exception. And indeed, we learn that Zosima himself isn't approved of by many in the church. Some of them see him as undermining, indeed, the true objective teaching of orthodoxy. So many possibilities. Perhaps this, perhaps that. Who knows what the past means for the present? Particularly when the past is a novelist such as Dostoevsky. It's always an open question. And therefore, I think we do have to resist the specious argument that we can safely identify the Russian world's ideologies, Dostoevsky, with the writer, Fyodor Mikhailovich Dostoevsky. Like other great authors, Dostoevsky continues to be generative of multiple insights and fresh insights into the human condition, for good and ill. And if for ill, then also for good. Thank you.
George, thank you very much. You know, I was thinking while I was listening to your talk how, coming from Bulgaria, from this part of the world, where everybody in my generation grew up by having in their house all the Dostoevsky novels. Whatever else you had, there was Dostoevsky there. And every child would read Dostoevsky. But I think at the same time when people talk about Dostoevsky's politics, it's so very normal to go to his Diary of a Writer. And I think that the novels are so much more than his political ideas in the Diary of a Writer. And I'm thinking about what Diana said in her talk, how you read Florensky or Rozanov and there are these anti-Semitic ideas that you don't pay attention to. And I think very often with Dostoevsky too, you read the novels and there's so much there, there's so many layers of meaning. And then you go to the Diary of a Writer and you start reading his sort of political ideas, concrete ideas, and they're very often so boring, so disappointing, and so much less than what you have in the novels. And I think that probably one of the problems when, in these articles that I was citing and you cited and so on, is that when you look at the way that Dostoevsky's writings have been weaponized nowadays by the Putin regime, the patriarch, and people of that sort, when you go to the novels, things look one way. When you go to his concrete ideas and ideology presented in his Diary of a Writer, it's sort of a completely different thing. He wasn't, I think, as you said, he wasn't a great poet. He wasn't a great political scientist, but
I think
what a great author and novelist he was.
I mean, I think I'd like to agree with you, but I don't.
You don't?
No,
oh, that's great.
I don't. I mean, there's some interesting differences. And one thing is that, in Germany, the politische Schriften were published in, I think, 1917 and played a very big part in the German reception of Dostoevsky, whereas the Diary of a Writer wasn't translated into English until 1984. So it was kind of very, very marginal in the English reception and American reception of Dostoevsky. And so it's been quite easy to ignore it, in a sense, in the Anglophone literature, because it just wasn't there. I think when you look at the Diary of a Writer, it's a very complex series of writings. And of course, this is where we find these sort of, one might say, dreadful things about Constantinople will be ours and all of that. But it's also where some of his best short stories, like A Gentle Spirit and The Dream of a Ridiculous Man, they also occur in the diary. The Little Boy at Christ's Christmas Tree. Also articles on prison reform. A lot of articles on suicide, particularly on suicide amongst women, and this story that he took up and transformed in A Gentle Spirit of this woman who jumped out of a window clutching a cross. It's also where we find his intervention in the case of the woman who chucked her baby out of a window, where he basically, in a sense, without using the words, invented the concept of postnatal depression and secured the release of this woman after kind of months of publicist activity. And so what I see going on in the diary is an exploration that is at some points in the diary explicitly fictional, at some points very sort of feuilletonist, at sometimes directly polemical. He's kind of working on simultaneously, as it were, on all aspects of Russia, on what it would be for Russia to be a Christian society. And this means looking at prison reform as well as Constantinople will be ours. So it's kind of create this model of a country that would be a truly Christian country. Of course, and then the case is, of course, it bang slap up against the fact that Tsarist autocracy wasn't like that. And the Tsar, Alexander III didn't forgive the assassin of his father in the way that Solovyov hoped, and Dostoevsky would probably have hoped as well. That it seems more likely that, as Merezhkovsky said, actually it's the same brutal autocratic rule, Caesarism, whether you call it Tsar or whether you call it Lenin, that it's the same thing. That too perhaps has its problems. So clearly he read much of the situation in a wrong way. But it seems to me that the Diary of a Writer is actually a very important text that we have to wrestle with if we're going to get the whole Dostoevsky. And as I say, some of the bits in it, like A Gentle Spirit, some of his greatest fiction is there as well. So it's a complicated thing, and it is off-putting, but we have to wrestle with it. But as you say, it's or someone said in the last session, it's a bit like the problem of Heidegger's Nazism. I mean, here you have this person who obviously has very different schools of philosophy in the 20th century, and many people in analytic philosophy just don't like that sort of stuff at all. But if you're thinking about the continental tradition, I mean, the English kind of critic George Steiner said of Heidegger is that he's the only one of our contemporaries that we can be sure people will be studying in 500 years' time. I mean, that some of his thinking, the novelty and the originality of his thinking is breathtaking. I mean, I'm obviously getting confessional now, but I mean, he kind of says things that just hadn't been possible for anyone to say before. Extraordinary insights, whether or not they're right or correct, but they kind of put whole sets of new problems on the table. And yet, he clearly did support the Nazi Party, entered it in a very public way, encouraged his students to vote for Hitler. How do you put these things together? I mean, Dostoevsky would have known, and knows from his novels, that human beings are very complex entities. There's someone in the Idiot who says, who knows what makes a human being act the way they do, and people who act completely against the tendency of their personalities as they're known to the people around them. People who have false exteriors, people have multiple exteriors. It's we don't fit into neat boxes, and of course the line between, as it were, the good bits of Heidegger and the bad bits of Heidegger, and the good bits of Dostoevsky and the bad bits of Dostoevsky. It's too much for a neat surgical operation to pull the one out and leave the other. So there it is. It's a mess.
Yes, Christoph, please.
Well, thank you very much. I think. Thank you very much for a really interesting paper. I think there is no question that all these ideas you mentioned in your paper are floating around in Russia now. And there is no question that the conflict between Russia and Ukraine and NATO is interpreted in metaphysical terms, in the sense that Russia is considered to be the last bastion of Christianity and has to defend itself against the onslaught of the Antichrist, which is the Western liberalism. However, I am not entirely convinced that this ideology or ideologies are the cause for the war. Because when Putin came to power, 20 years ago, he was not anti-Western at all. He wanted a strong, independent Russia that is part of the world community and also part of the Western world, but a strong, independent Russia. And that wasn't possible because the Americans wouldn't allow it. And this led to a process of alienation. And so what I think was missing in your paper is the political and military aspect of this conflict. I'm not sure it can be explained in terms of ideology, although this is a kind of meta perspective that is now certainly very, very common in Russia. But when you look at the American foreign policy in the last 20 or 30 years, I think this American foreign policy, NATO expansion, and also the events in Ukraine since Maidan, these events do really constitute an existential threat to Russia, but irrespective of any kind of ideology, I would more interpret it in political terms. So there is a Russian nation state, there is, American hegemony and its allies, and to some extent what they did in the last 20 years, these actions do constitute a threat to the existence of Russia as a nation state, now whether it's whatever ideology Russia follows. So I think this, again, the political and military aspect is, from my perspective, the main cause.
Well, two separate things. I mean, one is as regards my paper, you're criticizing me for doing something I never even intended or attempted to do. It wasn't my intention to say that any of this explains what's happened in the last year. I'm speaking merely as a reader of Dostoevsky. I'm seeing that certain claims are being made about Dostoevsky and about his relevance to the contemporary situation, and I'm questioning whether those claims are in fact good claims seen in a literary and historical perspective, and saying that at very least they're questionable, and actually I don't think they are good claims. So that's a quite separate thing from trying to say that this set of ideas is a cause of the war. You know, well, I know from our brief exchange yesterday, and others will have had similar conversations in all manner of contexts, that there is room for huge disagreement about that. I mean, I have been following American policy actively for 60 years of my politically aware life, and I have demonstrated against American foreign policy in connection with the war in Vietnam many times, the invasion of Cambodia, the arrest and detention of Angela Davis, the invasion of Iraq, and I've encouraged others to do so, and I've been arrested in the process. I mean, I'm not a friend of American foreign policy. But it does seem to me the case, a kind of, one can mythicize America. I mean, going off Dostoevsky now, that America doesn't have the power that some Americans think it has, and certain Americans would like it to have. I mean, the world actually is much more multipolar than certain American ideologists might think it is, that neither Putin nor anyone else has to make the world multipolar. I mean, it is, and always has been. And that there is scope within this actual multipolarity for Russia to have followed a very different path from the one it has, and that is down to those, not only Putin, of course, but those who have had the responsibility of leadership in that period. I mean, it didn't have to be Yeltsin. Other things could have happened, and of course, and I entirely agree, that the West could have played a much better part, that the reluctance of Reagan and Thatcher to support anything that might be seen as socialist, and the failure to give economic support to help Russia evolve from the kind of, from the Soviet Union to a viable social democracy was catastrophic. But even despite that failure, you know, I mean, Russia in the last 30 years, it has to be said, is at least in part the author of its own misfortunes. And many of the people, I don't want to take us away from Dostoevsky too far on this, of course, is as you say, is in a sense entirely independent of what anyone makes of Dostoevsky, but many of those who have been robbing Russia and pauperizing its people have been from the West, but they've also been Russians. No doubt about that. So it's complex. And I mean, I think just to see America as this, as it were, a school bully who controls everything, I just don't think that's the case. But that has perhaps nothing directly to do with Dostoevsky.
Shall we move back to Dostoevsky? Manu, do you want to say anything?
I have a question out of complete ignorance. If one were only to read Dostoevsky's non-fiction and his letters, what picture would emerge? So this is not about what people think they know of him through the novels, but methodologically to say, out of a spirit of epistemological humility, that you cannot understand what Dostoevsky thinks because you cannot discern that and separate it from his creative abilities as a writer.
Well, as I said in response to Clemena, I think it's probably a mistake to speak about his non-fictional writings as if they were simply a statement of the actual Dostoevsky's actual views. And the Diary of a Writer, where most of these, the German collection of Die politische Schriften is basically a selection from the Diary of a Writer, it's not like that. It's a very complex set of writings with multiple voices, multiple ironies, multiple disavowals. As I say, and he invents characters like the paradoxicalist to put forth opinions that later on he does state in his own voice, whatever that is. Some of it certainly seems to be coming directly in his own voice, but the whole thing's constantly mixed up as well, which I haven't mentioned. A lot of it's about his views on literature, his responses to George Sand, to Tolstoy, to other literary contemporaries. And in a sense, part of the real, actual Dostoevsky, as it were, isn't a sort of little set of opinions, but is precisely this, what Bakhtin famously called polyphonic voice. I mean, Dostoevsky is multiple voices, and having these voices, well, sometimes crashing together, sometimes speaking gently to each other, sometimes comprehensively, sometimes incomprehensibly. And I think there's an important point there in this. Of course, it's not only Dostoevsky, there's this long Russian tradition now of criticizing Cartesian subjectivity, of seeing the human being in terms of the ego, the rational I that has certain beliefs about the nature of the world, the universe, politics, whatever it may be, and has argued instead for this category of personality that is somehow trans-individual, if you like, or perichoretic, even so some would say that. And I think that's actually right. And I think that's really what we see in Dostoevsky, and what's really valuable in it, in reading him, is an education, if you like, away from the assumption, the mistaken assumption that I am I, if you like. I am who I am because of the multiple voices that I have interiorized in the course of my life, and that I am able to articulate in a discourse about myself only on the basis of a language that, as Derrida said, I have only one language and it's not my own. I mean, English language wasn't invented in order to enable me to express the things that are specific to my ego. I have to talk about myself in a language I've got from other people, from my mother, from my primary carers, from my school, from my village, and the various places where I've lived. So I'm not me at all. And when you get to be as old as me, and you think about your childhood memories, you think, did that happen to me, or did that happen to somebody else? Or that some of your memories are actually things, you kind of work out that some of your memories are things people said to you, when you were 4 or 5 years old. And you now think they're your memories, or maybe a photograph you saw of yourself as a baby when you were 6. And you now think that was your memory of yourself. That, these are kind of marginal phenomena, but I think they issue up a truth. And I think it's very interesting that Dostoevsky readers like Bakhtin, but not only Bakhtin, but the other Russian theorists of language in the interwar years, Bakhtin, Voloshinov, Gustav Spett, and others, give this extraordinary prominence to the role of language, that we are to be understood as human beings, not primarily from the perspective of the individual subjective self-consciousness, but from the perspective of the discourse that we have with one another. That is invariably multi-sided and emerges. I mean, when I started answering your question, I didn't know exactly what I was going to say. None of us do. When you start a sentence, unless you're an extremely sort of professional performer, you don't know how you're going to end your sentence, whether you're in a restaurant or a seminar or whatever. That who we are becoming through our interactions with each other is this kind of multi-sided, open-ended thing. Now, it would be very, really difficult and kind of to live like that. We need, as it were, the fiction of the I, that we're each of us self-conscious, independent egos to sort of negotiate the world we're in. But I think it is probably a fiction.
Are you saying then that the categories of fiction and non-fiction are not useful when thinking about what Dostoevsky has written?
Exactly that.
Okay.
Or I think
there is no methodological way.
I think there is there is no absolute division between them. That one can say, clearly in some cases, Dostoevsky is talking about a war that is actually happening in the Balkans where soldiers are fighting against each other. We might say that's reality. And in other cases, he's talking about things that he's entirely made up and that never happened anywhere. But of course, even the novels, are shot through with things that he read in the newspapers and that he puts into the novels, or that he adapts. So again, to go back to this little short story, A Gentle Spirit, about a woman who commits suicide by jumping out of the apartment window, clutching an icon. Now, there was a real-life story that Dostoevsky read and commented on in the diary of a writer, in which just this happened. Then he takes this real-life incident and turns it into a story. What we read in the story is we don't know anything really about the circumstances behind the actual suicide, so that all the time, as it were, he's taking what we might say is part of the reality of everyday life and fictionalizing it, or bringing things directly into it. When Ivan Karamazov attacks God, as it were, for allowing the suffering of children, the examples he takes are examples Dostoevsky read in the newspapers. So this is happening in a work of fiction, but it's, as it were, real stuff.
But what about his letters?
But
His letters?
His letters. Well, quite a lot of them are about money and asking people to lend him money, and that's rather important too. But
Can one understand anything about him? Because it seems to me that if one insists on polyphonic voices, it makes him completely impervious to any kind of historical analysis.
No, it just means you have to work very hard at it, because you have to track the origins and the trajectories of these multiple voices and their interactions.
Yeah, from the letters you get the idea he had money problems. That's what you get there. Yes.
I think this line of questioning is interesting because it reveals our kind of discomfort with Dostoevsky's sort of multi-voicedness and our inability to pin him down. And if only there were some way to know what he really thought. But going back to these 3 points that you made early on, and maybe I misunderstood, but belief in a kind of benign sovereign leader, Christian faith, and the peasant as a sort of embodiment or in the mold of Christ. So are these then core beliefs that shine through all this multi-voiced sort of texture of Dostoevsky? And if they are, is there a kind of sense of disappointment that they are less sort of innovative than one would imagine or expect from a thinker like Dostoevsky? To me, it resonates a bit because I studied Tolstoy, and sort of to read Tolstoy and then to read Tolstoy's What is Art is to be intensely disappointed in the conclusions that he comes to, having sort of lived through all of these and thought through all of these experiences related to art making and the reception of art.
I think that they are, but in a way, lead the Tsar out of it almost, because obviously, and I think this is right, but I'm open to correction if others know better, that in the conditions of censorship, to write about the Tsar in fiction would be very, very difficult, actually, paradoxically perhaps to us, but much more difficult than writing about the Tsar in a kind of journalist thing, because it would seem to diminish, as it were, the majesty of the Tsar, at least. But anyway, I put him on one side here because clearly Tolstoy does. But yeah, but orthodoxy and the peasant heart, I mean, you know, these are in a way articles of faith in Dostoevsky, and yet then we say, well, what is orthodoxy? As I say, he's pretty brutal about some of the clergy, like the priest who comes to take the funeral of Marmeladov in Crime and Punishment. You know, he comes in and out and he's basically just there for the money, which isn't kind of quite what many Orthodox would like to see their clergy as. Bishop Tikhon is a much more sympathetic figure, and yet he's also kind of, in some way, inept. He doesn't quite get Stavrogin, or he gets it, but he's unable to communicate it. So I think for Dostoevsky, it's very much, you know, orthodoxy is not what the patriarch in Moscow says. Orthodoxy is kind of what you experience when the peasant goes to the village church and prays for their son who's away in the army, or for their mother who's sick. That's where, as it were, real orthodoxy is to be found, in a way, is in the everyday practice of it. So so maybe there's a little ambivalence there. And even when he's writing about the peasantry, of course, you know, he has these great eulogies, if you like, of the Christian kindness he saw in the Russian peasants, but he's quite brutal himself and frank in describing their violence and depravity. You know, the wife beating, or the story in House of the Dead, I can't remember the names of this, you know, peasant in prison who's basically murdered his girlfriend because he thought she looked at another man, and then subjected her to this kind of terrifying, you know, so he knows this isn't, as it were, a simple sort of rural idyll painting these wonderful looking people who are kind and nice to everybody, not at all. But he's saying, again, you know, the complexity of people, even these people, even these convicts could show gentleness and love. And, you know, and when they went to church, they prayed for forgiveness. They really meant it, even if they went and got drunk the next day and kind of fought. That it, you know, this is all very unsatisfactory from the point of view of Protestant moralism. But that's right. Well, I suppose if you're a Protestant moralist like me, you know, that's why it's so good to read Dostoevsky, because you realize it you know, we just don't fit in those compartments in that way. And even with regard to politics, as this strange reported conversation from towards his death, towards the time of his death, when he's talking to someone, he says, you know, if you learned, I may have the details not quite correct, but he said, you know, if you learned that someone had planted a bomb, would you report it to the police? And they agreed that they wouldn't report it to the police. So even this person who's a fervent supporter of the Tsar, kind of those who'd somehow been on that side of the argument, they would be ashamed to report it to the police. And indeed, Viktor Shklovsky, the Russian critic, you know, some people think Dostoevsky is probably going to die anyway from emphysema and basically smoking and other stuff. But probably his final illness was brought on by his having terrible family rows about money. That kind of got him into a terrible state. But Shklovsky's argument was actually that I think the day before Dostoevsky died, a member of one of the terrorist cells who lived in the same block was arrested. Someone who was very well known. And Shklovsky's argument actually it was the shock of this that kind of flipped Dostoevsky. I mean, who knows? But just to say that there's some testimony that even though he totally distanced himself from, as it were, the kind of circles he moved in the 1840s, that, you know, never entirely. And he obviously retained some kind of understanding for the sort of wavelength that those people were on, even if he by then disapproved of them. So extraordinary. When the Russian royal family, on the other hand, and he was a kind of tutor to the, I think the grandson of Alexander II for a while, when the Russian royal family were on holiday with Queen Victoria in the Isle of Wight. I love this picture. They read Dostoevsky. You know, I imagine them sitting out in the grounds of Queen Victoria's palace in their deck chairs reading Crime and Punishment. It's kind of bizarre, really. So, which has gone off from your question, but...
Yes, Christoph.
Thank you. As you know, René Girard wrote a book on Dostoevsky. I think it's called Resurrection from the Underground or something.
It is in English. I can't remember the French title offhand, but...
I think Resurrection from the Underground. That's the title of the English translation. And if I understand correctly, what he's trying to do is to show how Dostoevsky's, let's say, spiritual development manifests itself in his novel, so how his views changed. And when I read the book, I find it extremely fascinating, also from a theological perspective. My question to you, because I'm not a Dostoevsky scholar, how convincing is this account of Dostoevsky's development as a writer?
Well,
because he comes to the conclusion that at the end, that because somehow of this development, now Dostoevsky is the greatest writer ever, or at least outperforms, you know, any Western writer in the 19th century. So does this make sense to you, or is it...
Well, basically, I can't answer your question because it's probably about 10 years since I read Girard, and I can't remember exactly that aspect of it. What I do remember from it, and I think what's very important for Girard's own development as a theorist, is that what he finds in Dostoevsky is a model for mimetic rivalry that becomes a key to his own theoretical contribution. I think it's very interesting. It also goes back to the previous question, the discussion about the I and the person. So for Girard, basically, we learn our desires from each other. You know, that and he uses literary examples like Dostoevsky or Shakespeare, that someone tells someone about the beautiful girl that everyone loves. And so then they meet her and they fall in love with her, because they're, as it were, primed to do so. And this becomes very important in Girard's variation on Freud. So because for Freud, it seems to have been the case that the development of the Oedipus complex is basically a kind of biological necessity, that at a certain age, the boy will sexually desire his mother and his father will be an obstacle to the fulfillment of that desire. This all happening at about the age of 4, and so he'll want to kill the father to get rid of him. And this is, as it were, simply a biological fact. But Girard says, no, it's not like that. It's because the boy emulates his father that he desires what the father desires, and he sees that what the father desires is the mother. And that's why he desires it. So it's not, as it were, a biological necessity, but it's a learnt desire. And he sees that in several of Dostoevsky's novels, particularly the Eternal Husband and various other ones, where there are these triangles of desire. And if one's thinking about The Idiot, about Prince Mushkin and Rogozhin and Nastasia Filipovna, and again in tune with Girard's theories, before Mushkin meets Nastasia, he sees the photograph of her and he hears people talking about what a kind of extraordinary and desirable woman she is. So he's, his curiosity, as it were, is already piqued. He's already fascinated by her before he even meets her. And I think Girard's right to see something. I think there are those kind of insights into the fact that desires can be learnt from each other, but also, of course, not only the desires that lead to violence and murder, but also, the desires that lead to goodness and holiness as well, and the importance perhaps of someone like the elder who can present someone like Alyosha with a role model, as it were, of how to be Christian, what it would actually mean to live out a Christ-like life. That too is something that one doesn't, as it were, read a book and become convinced of the truth of Christianity and then go out and try to do it, whatever that means. But one encounters someone who shows an attractive and desirable way of living out Christian belief, and that's what motivates and moves.
Thank you very much. So thanks, George. And thank you all very much for the discussion and for coming and for being interested. I think that now the speakers deserve some dinner. So thank you very much for coming. And George, thanks.